Hi, Dave here again, and thought that we would do a little bit more supplemental work on the seven churches of Revelation. I felt like, even in two sessions, that it was a little bit tough to cover and kind of had to rush through a few things. So, if you'd like to watch this, I'm pleased that you are here with me, and we're pretty much set. I've got my iced tea here to keep my whistle wet, as they say. And so I'm just going to kind of go through seven churches of Revelation again. And so then that way it's a little bit more in depth than I was able to a couple weeks ago in service. Got quite a few resources and things, so I'll be looking off to this direction and looking back at you and all of that. I told you before that my teaching style is kind of, I consider myself kind of a shade tree theologian to a certain extent. I've had formal training and I'm going through more formal training now. And but I kind of use the grammatical historical method of teaching. And so the approaches to the scripture I like to use is to examine the syntax, the grammar, and also look at the etymology of the scriptures as we are going through that, and the etymology of the words and all, and look at it also within the historical context within that. So remember that there is a blessing in Revelation 1:3. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and obey it, what is written in it, because the time is near. So there is a blessing of just us reading it and, putting it together. One of the things that I always say is text without context is pretext. And what that means is that within the text that we have to look at the verses that are before it and after it and kind of keep it in context of where it is that we're going. And I know that if you've listened to me teach before that you know about that quite a bit. So let's go ahead and we're going to get into the seven churches here. And these churches that Jesus was talking about in Revelation 2 and 3 are actual churches in Asia Minor, and they're in pretty close proximity of each other and all. And so what I wanted to do was just kind of expand a little bit on the churches and kind of where we were heading with that. So Jesus is talking to the churches, and he begins, of course, with coming up and saying that he holds the seven stars in his right hands, which are the pastors or the messengers of the churches, and he walks among the seven golden candlesticks, and the seven golden candlesticks are the churches themselves. Okay, we have talked about a chronological look at the seven churches, in that we've noticed that the message of Jesus that he gave to the churches bore an uncanny likeness to the characteristics of various time periods throughout church history. And this method that we're talking about is referred to as the historical prophetic interpretation of the seven books of Revelation. Interestingly enough, they coincide exactly in the order that Jesus addressed the churches with the time periods down through history. So around the 16th century, the non-separatist Puritan theologian Thomas Brightman is generally credited with being the first to systematically propose the historic interpretation of the seven churches of Revelation, which we're talking about, of course, Revelation chapter 2 and 3 here. He interpreted the seven churches as prophetic descriptions of seven consecutive historical periods in the history of the Christian church. And so, as we look at this, some of the key aspects of this interpretation include methodology. Brightman outlined how the seven churches represent distinct successive ages of the Church of Christ, beginning from the apostolic era and moving toward the second coming of Christ. Now, remember that that when we talk about the second coming and we talk about the rapture, when we talk about the rapture of the church, Jesus is going to come down. He's going to ascend in the clouds. He is not going to touch down on earth at that point. And then at the second coming, he will come back with the multitude of saints with him, riding on a white horse, and he will touch down on earth. That'll be kind of when the Battle of Armageddon is and all of that. When this one is talking about the apostolic era to moving to the second coming, they are using that interchangeably with the word rapture. And so what he's talking about, of course, is the rapture there. So we'll kind of go through this a little bit with the chronological framework as we kind of get into these churches a little bit more. So while other early commentators like Victor Enos in the 3rd century noted that the churches represented the church universal, it was Brightman who popularized the specific sequential historical age interpretation, and we'll kind of hit that a little bit as we go. Now, when we look at Revelation 2, Jesus says to the angel of the church in Ephesus, "Write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand." Remember, the 7 stars are the pastors or the messengers. When he's holding them in his right hand, that is the symbol of authority in the Bible. Anytime you have the right hand, it's always the symbol of authority. So he holds the 7 stars in his right hands and walks among the 7 golden lampstands, or the 7 golden candlesticks. These are the 7 churches of Asia Minor that he's talking about. He says, "I know your deeds, your labor, and your perseverance, that there's no hint of compromise." We're going to see why in just a little bit. "I know that you cannot tolerate those who are evil, and you have tested and exposed as liars those who falsely claim to be apostles. Without growing weary, you have persevered and endured many things for the sake of my name. But I have this thing against you." Remember that in all of these churches, when he's talking to them, he compliments them first, and then at that point, then he comes in and he kind of has some correction that he does, and that's what he's doing here. So he says in verse number 4, "But I have this against you. You have abandoned your first love." We're going to talk more about that in a minute. "Therefore, keep in mind how far that you have fallen. Repent and perform the deeds that you did at first. But if you do not repent," and this is kind of a warning that he always puts in there too, "I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place." In other words, the church will be no more. We'll talk about that. "But," he says, "you have this to your credit. You hate the work of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate." The Nicolaitans were a sect of Greek philosophy, and it's Gnosticism. And it taught that the body was insufficient, that the only thing that was valuable was the soul, and whatever is done in the body or to the body is of no avail. So it was like grace on steroids, basically. And kind of as we look at that a little bit, with the Nicolaitans, let me look over here for a second. And I just had it here. when we talk about the Nicolaitans and the deeds of the Nicolaitans, scholars have kind of debated about this a little bit, the identity of the Nicolaitans, and it was a little bit tough. Sometimes they don't really know a great deal about them. But there was a person called Nicholas of Antioch who appears to have taken grace to an unscrupulous extreme. In other words, live any way that you want because you're a believer and you're under grace. And so this is something that is prevalent today a lot of times. It kind of goes back to that adage of, you kind of do you and I'll do me. You do what feels good to you, and why can't we all just get along? And there are no standards. Whatever it is that you think or that you do, that is you. And as long as you're not hurting someone else, then it doesn't matter. And this kind of appears to be a little bit of the thinking of the Nicolaitans. And so they thought, whatever was done in the body was the body, and the spirit was separate. And so it was, as I said, it was like grace on steroids. And so the big thing that we are going to see in these 7 churches is 2 predominant themes as we talk about this, and that is 1, the food sacrificed to idols, eating the meat and the food that was sacrificed to idols, and then also sexual immorality. And we're going to see this rampant because this is the culture of the first century at this point. Okay, and so we're going to talk more about that. And so the work of the Nicolaitans was that you could do anything that you wanted to. You could eat the meat that was sacrificed to idols. You could participate in any of the sexual immorality and the rituals that the Romans had, and anything goes. You live your life and I'll live mine. And, it doesn't really matter. And so that seems to kind of be what the thing is within that. So he goes on and he says, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who overcomes, I will grant the right to eat from the tree of life in the paradise of God. Okay, so this was the thing that Jesus said to the Ephesian church at this point. There was also something that he says to them, that you do not tolerate those who say that they are apostles, but they are not. Or in other words, they are false apostles. Now, there was a document that the early church had that was a manual, and it was called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles for the Gentile Churches. So this was an actual document that they went by. It was kind of like a handbook to them, and it was called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles for the Gentile Churches. One of the things in it says, if any missioner comes, he should be welcomed as the Lord, but he is not to stay more than a day or 2 days if really necessary. If he stays 3 days, he is not genuine. So he comes to visit, and he begins to teach, or he begins to preach, or he says that he's an apostle, and he can stay 2 days, but if he stays 3 days, he's not genuine. That would kind of throw a monkey wrench into all of our modern day 7-day revivals in certain denominations that we have there. But nevertheless, and again, the teaching of the 12 apostles for the Gentile churches. Okay, so if he stays 3 days, he's not genuine. If anyone comes to you speaking in a trance or with visions from God and says, give me money or anything else, do not listen to him. That kind of throws a monkey wrench into some things too. I was in a revival one time, and the preacher was up preaching, the evangelist, and he was going to take an offering. Now, usually the pastor would take a love offering every night for the evangelist and have people give. Well, this guy told the pastor, "No, I don't want you to take the offering. I'm going to take the offering." And so he went into this big spiel for about 15 minutes of blessing the man of God and honoring the man of God and all of that type of thing. And he made the statement. He said, "I believe this so much to the extent that I'm going to give the first $100 in this offering." And I sat there and I kind of looked at Jeannie and she kind of looked at me, and we're thinking, wait a minute, he's taking his own offering. He's going to receive the money and he's going to give the first $100 to himself. And so it's like, if we would have had this document, the teaching of the 12 apostles for the Gentile churches, we might have been alerted that things were a little bit awry on that. Okay, so it says, "Give me money or anything else. Do not listen to him. Let him not live in idleness simply because he says that he is a Christian." And so this was kind of a standard of the apostles back then. Well, Jesus is complimenting the Ephesian church and saying, you are doing some good things because you don't tolerate these people that say that they're apostles and are not. So he says you have discernment within that. And so he commends the Ephesians as kind of a model church that worked hard, that persevered under persecution, and discerned error from the truth. And so he starts off with that. As he continues on, he's going to say a couple of other different things. But let's talk about the historical prophetic area here. What has happened with all 7 of these churches is that we are kind of plugging them into different eras of history also. Now, this was done after the fact, of course, because they couldn't look all the way into the future to the 1900s, for instance. Okay, so remember that they put this together around the 1600s, but it kind of progressed and was added to. The historical prophetic era that we are talking about here for the Ephesian church is AD 30 to about AD 100. And they call it the apostolic church or the apostolic age. So it was kind of the pure church in that particular age with AD 30 to AD 100. That's kind of the age that they kind of say that this is likened unto. Okay, it didn't mean that the church lasted for that long. It doesn't mean that the other churches fit exactly year to year into that category. But as they were looking at this, they could look at it and they could see down through the ages what was going on. Just kind of like you and I go back and we talk about the industrial age, and we talk about the different epochs of history, the different eras of history that we go through. We went through the Revolutionary War, we went through the Civil War, we went through World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Iraqi War, all of that, and those are different eras and different things that happened within those different eras, and so we kind of plug those various things in. And as we're looking at this, the Ephesian church is considered the apostolic church, or the apostolic age, from about 30 AD to about 100 AD, as that fits within that. So in other words, the historical view of the apostolic age was here, and it went from about the time that Christ started to establish the church with his disciples all the way up to about 100 AD. Okay, we'll talk more about that. Okay, so the strength of the Ephesian churches is that they had sound doctrine, they had discernment, and they had perseverance. Okay, but Jesus had a concern, and that was that they had abandoned their first love, and their devotion to Christ had cooled and become routine. So what Jesus does is he says, remember those things, do your first works over, repent, and return to genuine love. And he says, if you do that, I'm going to give you access to the tree of life. Okay? Now, as we look at the Ephesian church, John was the pastor of Ephesus at this point. And so, of course, he had been exiled. And so he at this time that he wrote Revelation, he wasn't still the pastor. He was like in his 90s, if I remember right. And so he had been the pastor of Ephesus. So he knew when Jesus was talking to Ephesus, he knew what he was talking about. The predominant gods that were worshipped in Ephesus, the temple to the goddess Artemis was there. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. Remember that this is Roman culture. This is the first century. And Alexander the Great had conquered a great deal. And he had united the Roman Empire and made everybody speak the same language. Even though they were from different places, they were captured, some of them, and they were different people. He united them by having them all speak Greek. So what we had a Roman presence, a Roman society, and we had a Greek culture. Now the Greeks worshiped the body, and pretty much anything went. There was it was very much like our culture today. Homosexuality was quite prevalent. Sexual immorality was quite prevalent. And they worshiped the body. They worshiped themselves. And that's kind of the culture that we have today. As we look on social media, as we look in all of our different areas, it's just a worship of self. Why do you think we call it selfies? And we're just worshiping self. And that's kind of the way that this culture was, that all of these churches were immersed in. Okay, so the temple to the goddess Artemis was there. Now, John was the pastor of the Ephesian church. Paul had been with the Ephesians for 2.5 years. And Timothy had also come along and worked in the Ephesian church. So this was a church with some heavy hitters in it. The Apostle John, who had walked with Jesus, Paul the Apostle, one of the greatest that ever lived, and Timothy, his protege, that several letters were written to in the New Testament. And so you've got John, you've got Paul, you've got Timothy, who are all involved within the Ephesian church. Okay? So pretty outstanding church that Jesus starts with in this in the letters that he's sending to them. Okay, so in Ephesians there was rampant idol worship of Artemis and sexual immorality that went in, and sexual immorality was very much a part of the Roman worship of these gods and the participation within that. Another thing that made Ephesus stand out was that it was a seaport. Anytime you had a seaport, you had all kinds of new ideas and new things coming in, new manufacturing and new goods from all over the world that were coming in. So you had a lot of trade that was going on. It was very affluent. And the agora was the marketplace that was there, and it was huge. It was like one of our major malls on steroids. It was like the Mall of America, except it was the Mall of Ephesus and all of that. And so as you've got this culture that was founded like this, of course, Caesar was the ultimate in the Roman Empire. And he was worshipped as a god here. The entrance to the agora had incense. And when you would come into the marketplace, into the place where everybody gathered and everybody came along and all, there was incense that was there, and you would take some incense and you would offer it to Caesar as God. And many times you had to say, Caesar is Lord. It's almost like within the Catholic Church or something, if you come in to do something and you take some of the holy water and then, you cross yourself and that type of thing, then that's kind of the way this was, except they were worshiping Caesar and they were saying Caesar is God. We're going to see this a lot within these 7 churches, okay? And so you had this incense and you took it and you offered it to Caesar as God. Now, the temple of Artemis was the god of fertility, okay? So within the worship of the temple of Artemis, there were hundreds of temple prostitutes that within worship that you would come in, and part of your worship was to have sex with these prostitutes, okay? They were both male and female, because remember, Greek culture here. And so it was like the Caesars of this time, and some people know this and some people don't. Out of I think it was about the 16 different Caesars, 15 of them were homosexual, and they had homosexual relationships. So it was very much this Greek culture that they worshipped the body, they worshipped male and female. So in the temple of Artemis, being the god of fertility, part of that, when you came in to offer yourself to the god of fertility, of course, it was just a ritual that you have sex with these temple prostitutes, both male and female. In Ephesus, there was also 14 different temples to the different gods. What does that sound like in our culture? We have churches on every corner. Now, if they're Christian churches, of course, we're all worshiping God, Jehovah, God Almighty. But we also have all kinds of different houses of worship that may be a little bit off, or they may be worshiping false gods at this point. And so we can kind of understand this. So it's 14 temples to different gods in Ephesus. Okay. It was also home to the temple of the Emperor Domitian. Now, we've talked about Domitian before. One of the worst, probably the worst Caesar that history records was Nero, and very much persecuted the Christians. He would take Christians, he would dip them in oil, he would hang them up on poles and set them on fire in order to light his gardens. So when you went through the gardens of Nero, you had all these people that were hanging up on these poles, and they were actually the torches that they had been set on fire, simply because they were Christians. So rampant persecution. Nero was number 1 in this persecution of the Christians. Second to him was the Emperor Domitian. Okay? Now, where have we heard of him? Well, he's the one that actually took John into custody and wanted to kill him because of the things that he was doing and leading the Ephesian church, and so he boiled him in oil. But when he put him in the boiling oil, it didn't have any effect on him. It didn't kill him. Well, you can imagine that this made Domitian, pretty mad. And so he took the pastor of the Ephesus church and he tried to kill him by boiling him in oil. And none of these things were ever done in secret. They would do them in the middle of the Colosseum, or something like the Colosseum or the Circus Maximus or something like that. So wherever the stadium was that was in Ephesus, this is probably where it took place, or out in the public square, so that everybody could see it, so that everybody could revel in it. Could clap and cheer and all of that, and more importantly, to keep all of the other Christians in line. If you profess Christ, this is what's going to happen to you. So they tried boiling him in oil. It didn't work. It didn't kill him. So what does he decide to do? He decides to exile him to Patmos. And of course, this is where John got the revelation. Patmos back at that point was just a rocky island. It was a penal colony basically, and they would just send people there to die for the most part. So this was the Emperor Domitian, and Domitian had a statue that was 50 feet tall with his arms outstretched in power. You saw a little bit of a picture of this if you watched the movies, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and when they are sailing into, I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was like these huge statues that were there on each side with their arms outstretched. Now, this was not the statue of Domitian in the Lord of the Rings. That's not what I'm saying, but it was kind of like that. It was kind of that picture of that, if you can kind of think of it that way. So he had this statue that was 50 feet tall with his arms outstretched. And when you would enter the harbor of Ephesus, that statue is the first one that you could see. It was kind of like our Statue of Liberty, except this one was not liberating the people. This was saying Domitian is God, Domitian is power. And so when you are coming into Ephesus, that is what you are seeing. So remember that Domitian was second only to Nero in the way that he brutally persecuted the early church. And so once a year in Ephesus and around the Roman provinces and things, everyone had to bow to Caesar Domitian and worship him as a god. And so when Jesus says in verse number 2, I know your deeds, your labor, and your perseverance, no hint of compromise. I know that you cannot tolerate those who are evil, and you have tested and exposed them as liars, and who falsely claim to be apostles. This was the concept of the early church as judging the evil persons. Now, Ephesus was steeped in this culture and knew that Domitian was not God, because they worship Jehovah, of course. But when Jesus talks about this, and he talks to the Ephesian church about this judging the evil, he's not even necessarily talking about them as a church judging the evil of the world. We see this a lot in the church, because in a lot of sermons and a lot of teachings and things, it almost seems when I listen to them like they're designed to shock you and to scare you and to tell you how bad the world is and how evil it is. And it is. We can look and we can see how evil it is. You only have to go to the internet. I almost said you almost have to only pick up a newspaper. We don't do that a whole lot anymore. But you can just go to the internet, or you can go to the networks or whatever. And if you watch any type of news, you know that we are in a corrupt and evil society. And it seems like some churches try to kind of use that as shock value, so that it's almost like, I don't know if you ever saw that movie with Tom Hanks called News of the World. And I didn't get to watch the entire thing, but it was a really interesting concept. I watched part of it. Don't exactly remember why it was I didn't finish it. Probably watched it at night and I was falling asleep or something. But he would travel around. This was kind of like in the West in the early days, and he could read, and he would bring newspapers with him. And so he would come into this town, and they would have kind of a town hall meeting or something, and he would basically just get up and read the newspaper to them. And this is how it is that people would find out about the world. And this is how it is that they would get the news of the world. It's an interesting concept also. And if you think about it a little bit, we have instantaneous news. We have instantaneous information. I can Google pretty much just about anything, and it will come up on my screen and tell me something about it. It's an incredible age that we are living in. people, they poo-poo the internet because of all the bad things that are out there, but there are a ton of good things that are out there that you can learn. Anything that you want to learn, from fixing your car to painting your house to building something to, for instance, this is a new hobby of mine. I'm carving little wooden people and little wooden guys. Some of you have seen this. This is one that I'm working on right now. He's kind of a blockhead to a certain extent. But anyway, anything that you want to learn, you can go out on the internet, you can watch YouTube, and you can learn it, right? So it's an instantaneous type of thing. It wasn't always like that. My parents were World War II generation. My dad fought over in Germany. And at that point in the 1940s, when you wanted news, you had newspapers, but also you would go to the movies, and before the movies came on, instead of a bunch of trailers and things, they would have what they called newsreels. And a lot of it was, okay, this is what is going on in World War II over in Europe, for instance. And this is what is going on around the world over in Japan. And this is how the war's going and all of that. And so they would have these different newsreels that you would watch, okay? So to get back to my point, the church now seems to be news of the world. And, come to church, listen to the pastor tell you about how terrible and evil the world is, and here's the latest news cycle, and here's the latest thing, and a lot of it is politically driven and all of that type of thing, right? But this concept here that Jesus is talking about in the Ephesian church, when he talks about judging evil, he is not talking about the Ephesian church judging the evil of the Romans and the Greeks. He is talking about them judging the evil that is inside the church. Not Emperor Domitian, not Rome, not the world outside the church. And Jesus commends them for judging the evil that has crept into the Ephesian church itself. Just like Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 5. He says, what business of mine, this is 1 Corinthians 5:12, what business of mine is it to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked man from among you, Paul says. So he's talking about judging the people that are inside the church. Okay? The world is going to be the world. That's why I am not very shocked most of the time of different things that go on in the world, because I expect that out of them. And when I'm ministering to somebody, or I'm witnessing to somebody that is not a Christian, or I'm working with someone who is not a Christian, if they want to use profanity, or if they want to tell dirty stories, or they want to be evil to each other, they want to climb the corporate ladder and step on whoever it is that they can, they want to be underhanded and lie about you, and some of you experience this at work, we as Christians shouldn't be shocked, because that's the way that the world is. If those type of things go on inside the church, then we have to deal with it. And that's what Jesus was saying to the Ephesian church. He was commending them for dealing with this evil that was within them. And so we know that the world is going to be wicked. Don't spend so much of your time judging the world outside the body of Christ. Now, I personally don't spend a lot of time judging people that are inside the body of Christ. Again, I'm kind of more of a shade tree theologian than I am an apologist. An apologist defends the word and debates people, and this is the defense of the word of God and that type of thing. I do that to a certain extent sometimes, but I really study the word probably more than I have to defend it to anyone. Okay, and so this was saying that they were judging people that were inside the church, that were in a relationship with them inside the context of the church. And so, you know, what I do as a pastor is I pastor the flock, and I teach the flock. And if I see some of the members of our church or our fellowship that God has entrusted to me and that are kind of going a little bit astray, what I try to do is I try to get them back in order. And I do it in love, not with condemnation, but to do it for their own good and to do it in love. Okay. And so there was a number of things that they dealt with in the early churches and in these 7 churches. But one of the big issues that they were dealing with within the early church and at this time period was the false apostles and the false teachers that would come along. And so they were definitely heavily warned against this throughout the New Testament. And these things appeared in nearly every book of the New Testament about false teachers and false prophets and false apostles. Nearly every book in the New Testament except for Philemon. And it specifically specifically mentions false teachers. Like, for instance, in 2 Peter 2:1, false apostles in 2 Corinthians 11:13. And the Ephesians were complemented by warnings against not tolerating these false prophets, these brothers, these teachers. And it was also throughout the epistles of Acts and the Gospels that they talked about that and went into that. These people that came in and they wanted to kind of teach their own doctrines. They wanted to teach their own thing. And they were false apostles and false prophets throughout the New Testament. So 2 Corinthians talks about it. The books of Timothy talks about it. The Johannine epistles, which is John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and of course Revelation. And in the 2 Corinthians 11:13 through 15, Paul explicitly warns of false apostles and deceitful workers masquerading as apostles of Christ. What is this a picture of? It's a picture of what goes on in the church now, because we have all kinds of different people that come in, and they may say that they're pastors, they may say that they're teachers or evangelists or apostles or something, and it turns out that they are not, because they don't have the best interests of the body the body in mind. 2 Peter 2:1 mentions that there will be false teachers among the believers. A few more scriptures along these lines: Matthew 7:15, Matthew 24:11, Matthew 24:24. Jesus warns against false prophets and false Christs. People that actually came and said, "I'm the Christ, I'm the Messiah." And this was something that they had to put up with in the early church, that they showed up. Imagine the apostles who had walked with Jesus, who had seen him do all the miracles, seen him die, rise again, ascend back to the Father. They start pastoring these churches like Ephesus, and all of a sudden somebody walks in their door and says, yeah, I'm the Christ. I'm the Messiah. And I can see John going, "What are you talking about, man? I walked with him and I talked with him. You know, you're not the Christ." "Oh, well, you know, I'm the Christ second coming. You know, I've come back. I'm Jesus again." You know, it's like, no, you're not. And so 1 Timothy 4:1 through 3, Paul warns of the deceitful spirits and the doctrines of demons. 1 John 4:1, John tells believers to test the spirits because many false prophets have gone out into the world. And so all of these warnings were aimed at protecting the early church from deception and heresy, and often calling out individuals like Hymenaeus and Alexander and Philetus and others who came along and they distorted the faith. Now, as Jesus talks about the Ephesian church, he says that they have left their first love. So what's this mean? So, remember the old farmer? He had been married to his wife for 40 years, 50 years. And one day she says to him, "Why is it that you don't tell me that you love me anymore?" And he looks at her and he says, "Woman, I told you that I loved you at the altar, and if anything changes, I'll let you know." Right? I kind of get that picture when Jesus is talking about the Ephesian church leaving their first love. They all of a sudden were just kind of going through the motions. And that's kind of the way that you and I are sometimes now. It's like we've gotten saved, we've come to the knowledge of Christ, and remember that when we were first saved, that we were just on fire for Him, and we would evangelize, and it was such a great thing that I have discovered. Then I want to share the good news with you, and that's what the gospel means, is good news. And I want to share the good news with you, and I want to tell you because I'm so in love with Jesus. And then 5 years down the road, or 10 years down the road, or 15 years down the road, or 40 years down the road, it's like, are we as on fire as we were when we first got saved? This is what Jesus is saying to the Ephesian church. He says, you've left your first love because you're just going through the motions. They were going to church. They were trying not to sin. They were trying not to participate in the Roman culture and all of that. And they would come and they would give in the offering, and they would take their kids to youth group, and they volunteered once a while in children's church, and they were just being good Christians. But the Greek word that Jesus uses here is aphemi, which means to send away, to leave, to forgive, to permit, to abandon, to lay aside. And that's what Jesus was saying to the Ephesian church, was saying, you know what? You've abandoned your first love. You've abandoned me. You've abandoned your love of me and recognizing your mission to the world. And it had become a loveless labor. Sometimes the Ephesian church is called the loveless church. But it was a loveless labor. They were just going through the motions. And I wonder, how that is with you and me. Are we just going through the motions? Our church meets on Saturday nights. And not because we're Seventh-day Adventist or we only believe in meeting on the Sabbath, but that was just the occasion that we were able to get our building, because we meet at New Hills Church, and of course they have church on Sunday morning. And so they were gracious enough to allow us to rent out space in their building and to meet on Saturday nights. It was a throwback because I had always worked on Sunday through Wednesday. I'm not on that schedule right now, but nevertheless, that's where we meet. So do we just go through the motions of coming on Saturday night? Or if you attend a church that is that you go on Sunday morning, do you just go through the motion on Sunday morning? I'm going to sing a few songs, I'm going to hear the cool pastor, tell of something that's going on in the state of Colorado or wherever it is that you live, and try to make it relevant to us or something like that. And then you go home and you say, yeah, I've been to church. And you never really talk about it to anybody at work. Don't really talk about it to your neighbors. Don't really shine the light of Christ anywhere else or whatever. And you're just kind of going through the motions. You've lost the fervor. You've lost the first love. And Matthew 22, remember that the Pharisees came to Jesus, said, what's the greatest commandment? They're trying to trip him up, right? So Matthew 22:37, Jesus declared, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with your soul and with your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And then he says, oh, by the way, he says the second's like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he goes on to make the statements, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Love the Lord and love other people. If you and I as Christians would just take that as our mantra, how could we change the world? Love the Lord and love other people. There are a lot of churches that do that. There are a lot of Christians that do that. But apparently the Ephesian church, Jesus was saying, hey, you know what? You're not doing this anymore. You're just going through the motions. You've lost your first love. So we've got to get back to doing the things that the Lord wants us to do simply because we love him and because we have a fervor for that. So what does Jesus say? He says you've lost your first love. How do you get that back? What do you go back to? He says, go back and do your first works over again. You see, I am very much an advocate of constantly asking the Lord to forgive. You know, you do something, you say something, you have a bad attitude, you've got anger or something like that. It's like you got to go to the Lord and you got to say, Lord, forgive me for that, you know. And if I have wronged a person, then I try to go to that person and say, you know, I'm sorry. I blew up. I said that. Didn't really mean it. I've had to do that through the years with my wife, with my kids, with my grandkids. Just let them know I have feet of clay. I'm human. I blew it. I'm sorry. And it goes back to those two commandments. Love the Lord your God, ask forgiveness of him, and love others as yourself, ask forgiveness of theirs, right? So Jesus says to the Ephesian church, go back, do your first works over again. Get saved again, basically. Come back. Fall back in love with me, Jesus says, like you did at your first salvation experience. And he says, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear. In other words, if you have any brains or if you have any sense at all, listen to what I'm saying. And hear what I'm saying. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who overcomes, he goes on and he says, I will grant the right to eat from the tree of life in the paradise of God. What is he talking about there? He's talking about Genesis 3. Now, in the Garden of Eden, you had the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you had the tree of life. Many people, and I've talked about this before when we studied Genesis, many people take part of the first verse, or the verse that it talks about that, and they say that one of the trees in the garden was the tree of knowledge, and that's what Adam and Eve ate from, and that's when they sinned, and that's when the fall of mankind. And what they do is they use that as a picture of, well, you don't need any education except the Bible, you don't need to read anything else except the Bible, and you don't need to go to college, you don't need to go to seminary, you don't need to do any of those things to study the Bible because it's the tree of knowledge. And that's not true. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of knowledge. You and I have knowledge, we have learning, we have aspects, we understand how to communicate, we understand how to do math problems, we had to, understand all of those type of things. The sin was not the tree of knowledge, it was the tree of good, the knowledge of good and evil that they ate from, right? And so they had that tree, and they also had the tree of life. God intended to have a relationship with mankind because he came down and he walked in the cool of the evening with Adam and Eve and had fellowship with them. Until such point as they ate from that forbidden tree that God told them not to. He put it in the garden because he gave man free will. but the knowledge of good and evil was the one that they weren't supposed to touch and they weren't supposed to eat from. He didn't tell them not to eat from the tree of life. See, his intent was for them to live forever in communion and fellowship with him by eating of the tree of life. And as long as they ate from the tree of life, they were not going to die, right? So you had this tree there. Jesus says to the Ephesian church, to him who overcomes, I will grant the right to eat from the tree of life in the paradise of God. What's he talking about? He's talking about, I'm going to grant to you the way that I had intended for it to be from the beginning, and eat from that tree of life. Why was it that Adam and Eve, once they had eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they saw their sin, they saw their nakedness, and Satan had deceived them, and it was the fall of mankind, why was it that they couldn't live in the garden anymore? Why was it that God just didn't go ahead and send redemption at that point and redeem them from that, but instead what he did was he kicked them out of the garden? And so he kicks them out of the garden, and he sets a cherubim there to guard the garden with a flaming sword so that they couldn't get back in, right? Because once they had sinned, because they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if they were to continue to eat from the tree of life, they would continue to live forever in their sin unredeemed. And so he had to put them out of the garden. They couldn't eat from the tree of life anymore, and redemption would have to come another way. God couldn't allow them to continue in their sin. And really, when you look at it, that's the grace of God. In other words, they were sinners. They had separated themselves from God, and he wasn't going to allow them to live for eternity eating from the tree of life in their separation from him. So he puts them out of the garden, and mankind begins to die after a certain amount of time. And so he had to set in motion the prophecies and the coming of the Messiah and Jesus coming to die for mankind, to redeem them and bring them back to where God intended from the beginning. And this is what Jesus is talking about in Ephesians. If you overcome, I'm going to restore you back so that you can eat from the tree of life again forever in the paradise of God. And really that's part of what Revelation is all about. And so when he says that, it was Jesus telling the church at Ephesus, if you go back and you do your first works over again and you regain your first love, I'm going to restore you to how it was that originally my Father, and him, Jesus being God also, that we walked with mankind again. And so they didn't have to be separated from that. And that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the tree of life. And and with God separating them like that, it was actually the mercy of God that was going to restore them back to that. So Revelation 2:7, he who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who overcomes, I will grant the right to eat from the tree of life in the paradise of God. Okay? We will see this later on in Revelation 22. Because Revelation 22 says, the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God, and the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city, and on either side of the river was the tree of life. It was restored back to the way that God had intended for it in the beginning. And we will see later on in the book of Revelation, when we have the new heaven and the new earth, that it's going to be restored back to the way that God intended in the beginning with Adam and Eve, so that we will have fellowship with God, so that he can come down and walk with us in the cool of the day again. And Revelation 22 is talking about that. And that's exciting to think about that. Okay, so there is the first area, and as you have seen here, for me trying to cover all 7 of the churches in just a couple of different teachings would have been pretty tough, because we've already gone about an hour just on the church at Ephesus. So we will continue on, and I'm going to make some other videos on the 7 churches. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope that it clarified maybe a few things, and I didn't have to rush through it just because of the time factor, and that you were able just to kind of leisurely look at it and pause if you needed to, and get a drink of your own tea and all. And so we will talk about the other 7 churches. I will see you then.